The gunshot that rang out across the Montana plains that September morning in 1881 wasn't meant for Nathaniel Grant, but it changed her life all the same. She'd been traveling west for 3 weeks, her money nearly gone and her prospects even thinner, when the stagecoach she'd been riding in came under attack by desperate bandits. The driver took a bullet to the shoulder, and as the horses bolted in terror, Nathaniel found herself thrown from her seat, landing hard in the tall grass beside the rutted trail. By the time she caught her breath and stood on shaking legs, the coach was a cloud of dust in the distance, and she was alone on the endless prairie with nothing but the worn carpetbag that had fallen beside her. She'd been walking for 2 hours under the merciless sun when she spotted the ranch buildings shimmering in the heat. Her feet ached in her button-up boots, and her dark traveling dress was covered in dust and grass seeds. The homestead sprawled across a gentle valley, with a sturdy 2-story house, a massive barn, and several outbuildings arranged around a central yard. Cattle dotted the hillsides, and she could see men working in the distant fields, bringing in what looked like the late summer harvest. Nathaniel straightened her bonnet and tried to brush some of the dust from her skirts before she approached the main house. She was 22 years old, alone in a territory she didn't know, and desperate enough to beg for help if she had to. Her aunt in California was expecting her, but that was still hundreds of miles away, and right now she needed water and directions to the nearest town. A man emerged from the barn before she reached the house, and she stopped walking. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing dusty work clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face. When he looked up and saw her standing there in the yard, he went still for a moment, then started walking toward her with long, purposeful strides. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was deep and cautious. "You look lost." "I am," Nathaniel admitted, suddenly aware of how she must look, disheveled and alone. "The stagecoach I was on was attacked a few miles back. I was thrown off and they didn't stop." His expression darkened. "You hurt?" "No, just shaken. I've been walking since dawn." He studied her for a moment, and she saw his face clearly for the first time. He was perhaps 28 or 30, with strong features tanned dark by the sun, a straight nose, and eyes the color of summer sky. A few days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw, and his brown hair was overlong, curling slightly at his collar. "I'm Preston Yates," he said. "This is my ranch. Come inside, you need water and rest. I don't want to impose." "You're not. Come on." He gestured toward the house, and Nathaniel followed, too tired and thirsty to argue further. The interior of the house was surprisingly neat, but obviously lacking a woman's touch. The furniture was sturdy and practical. The floors were swept clean, but there were no curtains on the windows, no tablecloth, no decorative touches that would soften the masculine practicality of the space. Preston led her to the kitchen and pumped water into a tin cup, which she accepted gratefully. "Thank you," she said after she'd drunk deeply. "I'm Nathaniel Grant. I was traveling to California to live with my aunt." "Long way to go," Preston observed, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. "You have money for another ticket?" Nathaniel hesitated, then shook her head. "Most of what I had was in a trunk on that coach. I have a few dollars in my bag, but not enough to get me to California." Preston was quiet for a moment, his blue eyes thoughtful. "The nearest town is Columbus, about 15 miles northeast. Not much there, but there's a boarding house and a general store. Stage comes through twice a week." "I see." Nathaniel tried to keep the despair from her voice. 15 miles might as well be 100 with the few coins she had left. "How are you with cooking?" Preston asked suddenly. She blinked at the unexpected question. "I'm a good cook. I kept house for my father until he passed last spring." "I've got a dozen men working harvest right now," Preston said. "My cook quit 2 weeks ago, headed back east to his family. I've been trying to manage it myself, but I'm a rancher, not a cook. The men are complaining, and they've got a right to. I need someone who can feed them proper until the harvest is done. That's another 6 weeks, maybe 7. Nathaniel's heart began to beat faster. "Are you offering me work?" "I am. Room and board plus $30 when the harvest is done." "That should be enough to get you to California with something to spare." He paused. "You'd sleep in the spare room upstairs. Door has a lock. The men sleep in the bunkhouse, and they know better than to cause trouble on my property." $30. It was more than generous, and it would solve her immediate problem. But she was also keenly aware that she was alone, without references, accepting work from a stranger. Still, what choice did she have? "I accept," she said. "When do I start?" "Tonight. Supper's at 6. Men expect a hot breakfast at 5 in the morning and lunch at noon. You'll have help with the heavy work, fetching water and such. I'll show you where everything is." For the next hour, Preston walked her through the kitchen, showing her the pantry stocked with flour, salt pork, beans, and preserved vegetables, the root cellar with its stores of potatoes and carrots, the smokehouse with hanging hams and bacon. The ranch was well supplied, and she could see that despite his lack of skill in the kitchen, Preston ran a tight operation. "You manage all this yourself?" she asked as they returned to the house. "I've got a foreman, Jack Murphy. Good man. Been with me 5 years. And the hands are reliable mostly. This is my 5th harvest here. You started young. My father died when I was 23, left me this land and enough debt to drown in. Took me 3 years to dig out and start building it into something real." There was pride in his voice, but also an underlying weariness. "It's good land. Hard, but good." Nathaniel spent the rest of the afternoon preparing supper. She found a ham in the smokehouse and put it on to boil with beans, made a batch of biscuits that filled the kitchen with a warm, yeasty smell, and opened jars of preserved peaches for dessert. It felt good to work, to have a purpose and a place, even if it was temporary. The men came in at 6, dusty and tired, filing into the dining room that adjoined the kitchen. They were a mixed group, ranging from boys barely old enough to shave to grizzled veterans of ranch work. They eyed Nathaniel with curiosity but kept their distance, especially when Preston appeared and introduced her simply as their new cook. "Miss Grant will be preparing meals until the harvest is finished," he said. "I expect everyone to treat her with respect." There were nods and murmurs of agreement. And then the men fell on the food with the enthusiasm of hard workers facing a home-cooked meal after weeks of Preston's attempts at cooking. Nathaniel stayed in the kitchen, listening to the sounds of eating and conversation from the next room, and felt a small glow of satisfaction when she saw the empty plates returning. After the men had left and she'd cleaned the kitchen, Preston appeared in the doorway. "That was a good meal," he said. "Best we've had in weeks. Thank you. I'm glad they enjoyed it. You must be tired. I'll show you to your room." He led her upstairs to a small but clean bedroom with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the darkening prairie. True to his word, there was a lock on the door. "Breakfast at 5, he reminded her. "Sleep well, Miss Grant." "Nathaniel, please," she said. "Miss Grant sounds too formal for a cook." He smiled slightly, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "Nathaniel, then. Good night." She locked the door after he left and sank onto the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by everything that had happened since morning. She'd been attacked, abandoned, and was now living in the house of a stranger, cooking for a dozen ranch hands in the middle of the Montana Territory. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. The days began to blur together in a rhythm of hard work. Nathaniel rose before dawn to start breakfast. Thick slabs of bacon, eggs when the chickens were laying well, potatoes fried crispy and golden, biscuits or flapjacks, and strong coffee that could wake the dead. The men ate quickly and headed out to the fields, and she would clean up before starting preparations for the midday meal. Lunch was usually simple but substantial. Sandwiches made with thick slices of bread and cold meat, or stew that had been simmering since morning. Supper was her chance to show her skills, and she made roasts and pies, fried chicken and gravy, anything she could manage with the supplies available. Preston was often gone during the day, working alongside his men in the fields or riding out to check on the cattle scattered across his land. But he always came in for meals, sitting at the head of the long table in the dining room, listening to the men's chatter and occasional complaints. He was a fair boss. Nathaniel learned from listening to the conversations that drifted into the kitchen. Firm but not cruel, quick to praise good work and slow to anger over honest mistakes. She saw a different side of him in the evenings, after the hands had returned to the bunkhouse and the house was quiet. He would sometimes linger in the kitchen while she finished cleaning up, leaning against the doorframe and talking about the day's work, or asking her questions about her life before Montana. "My father was a school teacher," she told him one evening about 2 weeks into her employment. "In Ohio. We had a small house near the school, and after my mother died when I was 12, I took over the housekeeping. It was just the two of us." "That's young to lose a mother," Preston said quietly. "It was, but my father was a good man, patient and kind. He made sure I kept up with my education even while I was managing the house. He always said I had a mind too sharp to waste on just cooking and cleaning." She smiled at the memory. "Though I did plenty of both. Why California?" my aunt wrote after my father died. "She's a widow, no children of her own. She offered me a home, said there were opportunities out west for a woman willing to work." Nathaniel shrugged. "Ohio held nothing for me anymore. My father's debts took the house, and I had no other family there." "You got courage," Preston said. "Coming all this way alone, or foolishness, I'm not sure which. There's not much difference sometimes." He pushed off from the doorframe. "I'll say good night, another long day tomorrow." But he lingered a moment longer, his eyes on her face, and Nathaniel felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with exhaustion. Preston Yates was a good man. She'd learned that in the time she'd been here. Honest and hardworking, careful with his money but not stingy, respected by his men. And he was handsome, though she tried not to think about that too much. She was here to work, to earn enough money to continue her journey, not to develop feelings for her employer. The weather began to change as September gave way to October. The days were still warm, but the nights grew cold, and there was a new urgency to the harvest work. Preston drove the men hard but fairly, knowing they were racing against the first frost. Nathaniel found herself making larger meals, more food to fuel bodies working from dawn until well past dusk. One afternoon, she was in the root cellar selecting potatoes for supper when she heard shouting from the yard. She climbed the stairs quickly and emerged to see several of the hands carrying someone toward the house. Her stomach clenched when she realized it was Preston, his face pale beneath the dirt, one leg dragging. "What happened?" she demanded, hurrying forward. "Horse spooked and threw him," Jack Murphy said. The foreman was a stocky man in his 40s with iron-gray hair. "Landed wrong. I think his legs broke." They carried Preston into the parlor and laid him on the sofa. He was conscious but clearly in pain, his jaw clenched and sweat beading on his forehead. Nathaniel knelt beside him, her hands shaking slightly as she examined his leg. It was badly swollen already, and when she gently touched the area just below his knee, he hissed in pain. "We need a doctor," she said. "Nearest doctor's in Columbus," Jack said grimly. "That's 3 hours there and 3 hours back, and no guarantee he'll be sober enough to come. Then we'll have to manage ourselves." Nathaniel stood, forcing herself to think calmly. "I'll need straight boards for splints, bandages, and whiskey. Someone ride to Columbus anyway, get the doctor if you can. The rest of you back to work. There's nothing more you can do here." The men scattered to follow her orders, and she returned her attention to Preston. His eyes were half closed, his breathing shallow. She touched his shoulder gently. "Preston, I need to set your leg. It's going to hurt." "Do what you need to do," he said through gritted teeth. Jack returned with the supplies, and together they cut away Preston's pant leg. The break was bad, the bone clearly displaced, and Nathaniel said a silent prayer that she remembered enough from when her father had broken his arm years ago. She'd helped the doctor then, watching carefully as he worked. "Give him the whiskey," she told Jack, and the foreman held the bottle to Preston's lips. He drank deeply, then nodded to her. "Do it." Nathaniel grasped his leg firmly, feeling for the break. Preston's hand shot out and gripped the sofa cushion, his knuckles white, but he didn't cry out as she pulled gently but firmly, feeling the bone shift back into alignment. Jack held him still while she positioned the splints on either side of his leg and wrapped them tightly with strips of cloth torn from an old sheet. By the time she was finished, Preston had passed out, his face gray with pain and shock. Nathaniel sat back on her heels, her own hands trembling now that the immediate crisis was over. "You did good," Jack said quietly. "Real good. Where'd you learn that? I watched a doctor once. I just hope I did it right. Better than I could have done. I'll stay with him while you see to supper." Nathaniel nodded and stood, her legs unsteady. The other hands needed to eat. Harvest didn't stop for an injury, but her mind was on Preston lying unconscious in the parlor. She moved through the motions of cooking mechanically, her thoughts scattered. The doctor arrived after dark, a gray-haired man who smelled faintly of whiskey but whose hands were steady as he examined Preston's leg. He nodded approvingly at Nathaniel's work. "You set this?" "Yes, sir. Did a fine job. Couldn't have done better myself." "Keep him off it for at least 6 weeks, maybe 8. I'll leave laudanum for the pain." He looked at her with shrewd eyes. "You his wife?" "No, I'm the cook." "Well, you'll be his nurse too, looks like. He'll need watching the next few days, make sure fever doesn't set in." After the doctor left, Nathaniel moved a chair beside the sofa and sat down. Preston was still unconscious, his breathing deep and regular now. She dampened a cloth and wiped the sweat from his face, noting the strong line of his jaw, the way his lashes lay dark against his cheeks. Her heart ached in a way that had nothing to do with sympathy for an injured man, and everything to do with feelings she'd been trying to ignore for weeks. He woke near midnight, disoriented and in pain. She gave him a dose of laudanum and water, and he gripped her hand weakly. "Thank you," he whispered, "for taking care of me. Rest now. We'll talk in the morning." She dozed in the chair through the night, waking every few hours to check on him. By morning she was stiff and exhausted, but Preston's forehead was cool when she touched it, no sign of fever. She made breakfast for the hands, then brought Preston a bowl of porridge and more water. "You should be in bed," he said when she sat beside him. "You look worn out." "I'm fine. You're the one who needs to worry about yourself." "The doctor said 6 to 8 weeks before you can put weight on that leg." Preston closed his eyes briefly. "I can't afford to be laid up that long. It's harvest season. Jack and the men can manage. You need to heal. Jack's a good foreman, but he can't make the decisions I need to make. There's buying and selling to be done, supplies to order for winter." His frustration was clear in every line of his body. "Then you'll do that from here. But you're not riding anywhere or walking on that leg until it's healed properly. Do you understand?" He looked at her, and despite his pain, there was a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. "You're mighty bossy for a cook. Someone has to be, since you clearly can't be trusted to take care of yourself." Over the following days, they fell into a new routine. Nathaniel still cooked for the hands, but she also spent hours sitting with Preston, bringing him meals, helping him move when necessary, reading to him from the few books in the house. The ranch continued to function with Jack running the day-to-day operations and consulting with Preston every evening. It was during those long hours together that Nathaniel truly came to know him. He told her about growing up on this land, how his father had claimed it right after the war between the states, built it up from nothing, how he'd learned to ride before he could properly walk, how he'd worked alongside the ranch hands from the time he was tall enough to hold a pitchfork. "My father was hard," Preston said one afternoon. They were in his bedroom now. He'd insisted on being moved upstairs after 3 days on the sofa. He believed in work and more work, didn't have much use for softness or sentiment, but he loved this land and he taught me to love it too. "Do you ever get lonely out here?" Nathaniel asked. She was sitting in a chair by the window mending one of his shirts. Preston was quiet for a long moment. "Sometimes. I always figured I'd marry someday, have a family. But there's not many women out here, and the ones that are, they're already spoken for or not interested in the hard life of a ranch wife." He paused. "I guess I got used to being alone." Nathaniel bent her head over her sewing, her heart beating faster. "It doesn't have to be lonely if you find the right person." "No," he agreed softly. "I suppose it doesn't." The harvest finished in late October, and the men began to drift away, some heading to winter jobs elsewhere, others staying on for the reduced work of the cold months. Nathaniel's agreed-upon time was nearly up, but Preston's leg was still healing, and neither of them had mentioned her leaving. One evening in early November, after she'd brought him supper, and they'd talked for an hour about everything and nothing, Preston reached out and caught her hand as she stood to leave. "Stay," he said. "Not just tonight, but through the winter. You can still go to California in the spring if you want, but I need you here. I want you here." Nathaniel's breath caught. "Preston, I don't understand." "Yes, you do." He pulled her gently until she sat on the edge of the bed. "I've been half in love with you since the first week you were here. Watching you work, listening to you talk, seeing how you handle everything that comes your way with courage and grace. These past weeks, having you take care of me, it's made me realize I don't want to let you go." "I'm falling in love with you too," Nathaniel whispered, "but I'm scared. Everything has happened so fast." "Then we'll take it slow. Stay through the winter, let us get to know each other more. If come spring you still want to go to California, I won't stop you. But if you feel the way I hope you do, maybe you'll consider staying permanently." She looked into his blue eyes and saw honesty and hope there, and something deeper that made her pulse race. "I'll stay," she said, "through the winter, and we'll see where it leads." He smiled and lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "That's all I'm asking." The Montana winter descended hard and fast, bringing snow that piled in drifts against the buildings and wind that howled across the prairie. The remaining ranch hands, 5 men who'd signed on for winter work, stayed close to the bunkhouse when they weren't tending the animals. Nathaniel cooked and cleaned and cared for Preston, whose legs slowly healed under her watchful eye. By December, he was using crutches to move around the house, though he still couldn't put his full weight on the injured leg. But his spirits improved dramatically with the increased mobility, and he began to take a more active role in running the ranch again, even if it was from the warmth of the kitchen while Nathaniel worked. They talked for hours each day, learning each other's histories, preferences, dreams. Preston told her about his plans to expand the ranch, to improve his stock, to maybe one day own the largest spread in the territory. Nathaniel shared her love of books, her secret ambition to maybe one day teach like her father had, her enjoyment of simple pleasures like a well-tended garden or a perfectly risen loaf of bread. "You could teach," Preston said one snowy afternoon. "Columbus is growing. They might want a school teacher eventually." "You think so? I know so. You're educated, patient, good with people. You'd be wonderful at it." The first time he kissed her was on a cold evening in mid-December. She'd been stoking the fire in the parlor, and when she turned around, he was standing there without his crutches, balancing carefully on his good leg. Before she could scold him for being reckless, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her gently. It was a soft, sweet kiss, full of question and promise. Nathaniel's hands came up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. When they broke apart, they were both breathing hard. "I love you," Preston said simply. "I know it's soon. I know you might not feel the same yet, but I needed you to know." "I do feel the same," Nathaniel said, her voice shaking slightly. "I love you too. I think I have for weeks now." He kissed her again, deeper this time, and she felt herself melting into him. When they finally pulled apart, he was smiling, a real smile that lit up his entire face. "Marry me," he said. "Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. Say you'll be my wife, Nathaniel." She should have been shocked, should have asked for more time, but the answer rose to her lips as naturally as breathing. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." They stood together in front of the fire, holding each other, making quiet plans. They would marry in the spring, Preston said, when the weather was better and travel was easier. They could have a proper wedding in Columbus, invite the few neighbors scattered across the territory, make it a real celebration. But as the days passed and the snow piled higher, and as Nathaniel watched Preston hobbling around on his crutches, impatient to fully heal, she realized she didn't want to wait. She didn't want a big celebration or a fancy dress or months of planning. She wanted to be his wife, to truly belong here, to build a life together starting now. "Let's not wait until spring," she said one morning in late December. They were in the kitchen. She was kneading bread and he was sitting at the table going over supply lists. "Let's get married now, as soon as we can arrange it." Preston looked up, surprise and pleasure chasing across his face. "You're sure? We could do it proper in a few months, I'm sure. I don't need proper, I just need you." He stood, moving more easily now as his legs strengthened, and crossed to her. He pulled her into his arms, heedless of the flour on her hands. "Then we'll do it. I'll send Jack to Columbus tomorrow to arrange for the preacher to come out. We'll get married right here in this house." They were married on the 2nd of January, 1882, in the parlor of the ranch house with Jack Murphy and the other hands as witnesses. The preacher from Columbus was an elderly man who seemed pleased to perform a wedding, even one arranged with such haste. Nathaniel wore her best dress, a dark green wool that Preston said brought out the color of her eyes, and she carried a small bunch of dried flowers that one of the hands had awkwardly presented to her that morning. Preston stood tall beside her, still favoring his injured leg slightly but refusing to use the crutches for the ceremony. When the preacher asked if he took Nathaniel to be his lawfully wedded wife, his voice was strong and clear. "I do." And when it was her turn, Nathaniel looked into the blue eyes of the man she'd come to love and said the same words with equal conviction. They celebrated with a wedding supper that Nathaniel had prepared the day before: roast beef and potatoes, fresh bread, and a cake she'd managed to make despite the limited supplies. The hands ate heartily and made toasts to the newlyweds, their rough jokes and laughter filling the house with warmth. That night, after everyone had left and the house was quiet, Preston carried Nathaniel up the stairs to what was now their bedroom. He set her down gently, his hands lingering at her waist. "Are you happy?" he asked. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she answered honestly. "When I walked into your yard last September, I was lost and scared. Now I'm home." "You are home," he said, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "This is your home now, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing it." They made love slowly, tenderly, learning each other in this new way. Afterward, lying in Preston's arms with her head on his chest, Nathaniel felt a peace she hadn't known since before her father died. She belonged here with this man on this land. The path that had brought her here had been strange and circuitous, but it had led her exactly where she needed to be. The winter passed in a haze of contentment. Preston's leg healed completely by February, and he was able to return to full work. Nathaniel continued cooking and keeping house, but she also began to put her own stamp on the place, making curtains for the windows, starting plans for a garden she would plant in the spring, organizing the kitchen to her liking. Preston watched these changes with obvious pleasure, often coming up behind her while she worked to wrap his arms around her waist and kiss her neck. "I like seeing your touch on this place," he told her one evening. "It's been a house for so long, but you're turning it into a home." In March, Nathaniel began to suspect she was pregnant. Her monthly courses had stopped, and she felt queasy in the mornings, unable to face the smell of coffee that she usually loved. She waited another few weeks to be sure before telling Preston, wanting to be certain before raising his hopes. On a mild evening in early April, with the snow finally melting and the first hints of spring greening the prairie, she told him over supper. "I'm going to have a baby," she said simply. Preston froze with his fork halfway to his mouth. For a long moment he just stared at her, and she began to worry. Then his face split into the widest smile she'd ever seen, and he dropped the fork with a clatter, coming around the table to lift her out of her chair and spin her around. "A baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. "We're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Happy doesn't begin to cover it. He set her down carefully, his hands going to her still flat stomach. "When? October, I think. Around the time the harvest finishes." He laughed at that. "Fitting. You came into my life during harvest, and now we'll have a child then too." They began making preparations immediately. Preston started building a cradle in the evenings, working carefully with the wood to create something beautiful and sturdy. Nathaniel began sewing baby clothes from soft fabric Preston ordered from Columbus, tiny gowns and blankets that seemed impossibly small. The spring work was demanding, with calving season and then planting, but Preston hired extra hands to help, determined not to overwork his pregnant wife. Nathaniel protested that she was perfectly capable of her normal work, but she secretly appreciated his protectiveness. As her belly grew through the summer, Preston became even more attentive. He wouldn't let her lift anything heavy, insisted she rest in the afternoons, and rubbed her aching feet in the evenings while they talked about their plans for the future. "I want more children after this one," he said one night in July. They were sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "If you're willing, a house full of them." "I'd like that," Nathaniel said, her hand on her rounded stomach where the baby was kicking. "I grew up alone after my mother died. I want our children to have siblings, to have family. They will, and they'll grow up knowing they're loved and wanted, knowing this land is theirs." The harvest began in late August, and this year Preston hired a temporary cook to help Nathaniel with the increased work. She was grateful for the assistance, as moving around was becoming more difficult with the baby so large inside her. Preston hovered constantly, to the point where she finally had to shoo him back to the fields. "I'm fine," she insisted. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I won't break. I know, but you're my wife and that's my child. Let me worry. On an October morning when the fields were half harvested and the air had the crisp bite of coming winter, Nathaniel's pains began. She was in the kitchen starting breakfast when the first contraction hit, hard enough to make her grip the counter for support. She stood still until it passed, then called for Preston, who was already up and working in the barn. He came running, took one look at her face, and immediately sent one of the hands racing to Columbus for the doctor and the midwife. Then he helped Nathaniel upstairs to their bedroom, his face pale but his hands steady. "It's too early," she said between contractions. "The baby's not supposed to come for another few weeks. Babies come when they're ready. You're going to be fine. We're both going to be fine." The labor was long and hard. The midwife arrived by mid-morning, a capable woman named Mrs. Fletcher who delivered half the babies in the territory. She examined Nathaniel and pronounced everything normal, just taking its time. Preston stayed by Nathaniel's side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her face with cool cloths, whispering encouragement. By evening, when the pains were coming hard and fast, she was exhausted, but his presence gave her strength. "I can see the head," Mrs. Fletcher announced. "One more good push, dear." Nathaniel bore down with everything she had, and suddenly there was a release of pressure, and a thin, angry wail filled the room. She collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face as Mrs. Fletcher held up a squirming, red-faced baby. "A boy," the midwife announced. "A healthy boy." Preston's hand tightened on Nathaniel's, and when she looked at him, she saw tears in his eyes too. Mrs. Fletcher cleaned the baby quickly and wrapped him in a soft blanket before placing him in Nathaniel's arms. He was perfect. Tiny and red and wrinkled, but perfect. He had a thatch of dark hair, and when he opened his eyes, they were the same blue as his father's. Nathaniel felt her heart expand in a way she hadn't known was possible, love flooding through her so intensely it was almost painful. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you." Preston reached out with one finger to stroke the baby's cheek, his expression full of wonder. "He's beautiful. You're beautiful, both of you." "What should we name him?" Nathaniel asked. They discussed names but hadn't settled on anything definite. Now, looking at their son, Preston said, "Thomas, after your father, Thomas Yates." Nathaniel's eyes filled with fresh tears. "You do that. Your father was a good man from everything you've told me. I'd be honored to name our son after him." "Thomas," Nathaniel repeated softly, looking down at the baby in her arms. "Welcome to the world, Thomas." The weeks after Thomas's birth were a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings, but Nathaniel had never been happier. Preston was a devoted father, walking the floor with Thomas when he fussed, changing diapers without complaint, sitting and watching his son sleep with an expression of such tenderness it made Nathaniel's heart ache. The harvest finished in late October, and with it came the first snow. They settled into winter, the three of them, learning to be a family. Preston still ran the ranch, but he made sure to spend time each day with Nathaniel and Thomas, reading to them by the fire or simply holding his son while Nathaniel rested. "I never knew it could be like this," he told her one evening. Thomas was asleep in his cradle and they were curled up together on the sofa. "I never knew I could be this happy." "Neither did I," Nathaniel said. "A year ago I was alone and scared. Now I have you and Thomas in this life. It's more than I ever dreamed of." "It's just the beginning," Preston said, kissing her temple. "We've got years ahead of us, Nathaniel. Years to watch Thomas grow, to have more children, to build this ranch into something we can pass down to them. We've got a whole lifetime together." And they did. As the winter snows gave way to spring, and then another harvest season, their life together deepened and grew. Thomas thrived, growing from a tiny infant into a sturdy toddler with his father's eyes and his mother's determination. Nathaniel discovered she was pregnant again when Thomas was just over a year old, and this time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to expect. Their daughter was born in May of 1884, during a thunderstorm that rattled the windows of the ranch house. She came faster than Thomas had, and by the time the midwife arrived, Preston had already delivered his daughter himself, following Mrs. Fletcher's shouted instructions from downstairs while the storm raged outside. Nathaniel would never forget the look on his face as he held their daughter for the first time, this man who was so strong and capable reduced to tears by the tiny girl in his arms. "She's perfect," he said. "Absolutely perfect." They named her Margaret, after Preston's mother, but called her Maggie from the start. She was a calm baby, content to watch the world with wide eyes that eventually settled into a soft gray-green. Thomas, not quite understanding he had a sister but knowing she was important, would bring her his toys and pat her head gently. The ranch continued to prosper. Preston's careful management and hard work paid off, and by 1885 he'd expanded his holdings, buying the neighboring property when the owner decided to move back east. With more land came more responsibility, but also more security for their growing family. Nathaniel found her own rhythms, managing the household, caring for the children, and even starting to teach Thomas his letters and numbers. She loved watching her children grow, seeing bits of herself and Preston in them, and knowing they were building something lasting. In the summers, she planted extensive gardens, growing vegetables for the table and flowers for beauty. The ranch house began to look softer around the edges, with curtains and quilts and the accumulation of family life. The piano Preston bought her one Christmas filled the house with music in the evenings, and neighbors who'd once been just names began to become friends as the territory grew more settled. They had another son in 1887, whom they named James, and a second daughter, Catherine, in 1889. The house that had once seemed so large and empty was now full of noise and laughter, the sound of running feet and childish voices. Preston built additions to accommodate their growing family, and Nathaniel organized the chaos with patience and love. On their 8th wedding anniversary in January of 1890, Preston took Nathaniel into Columbus for a rare night away from the children, leaving them in the capable care of Jack Murphy's wife, Sarah, who'd moved to the ranch when Jack had married 3 years earlier. They had dinner at the hotel, a luxury they rarely indulged in, and afterward walked through the snowy streets of the town that had grown considerably since Nathaniel had first heard its name. "You ever regret it?" Preston asked, his arm around her waist. "Staying here instead of going to California, taking a chance on a rancher with a broken leg," Nathaniel laughed. "Never, not for a single moment. This is exactly where I'm supposed to be." "I think about that day you walked into my yard sometimes," Preston said. "How you looked, all dusty and determined. How I thought you were the prettiest thing I'd ever seen, even covered in trail dust. I hired you to cook, but I think some part of me knew even then that you were going to change my life." "And by winter you were planning our wedding," Nathaniel said, echoing the thought that had become family legend. "Though it was more like by winter we were getting married. I couldn't wait. Once I knew you loved me too, once I knew you were willing to build a life here, I couldn't stand the thought of waiting months." They stopped in front of the general store, looking at their reflections in the window. They'd both changed over the years. Preston had lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, and his hair was touched with gray at the temples. Nathaniel's face was softer than it had been at 22, shaped by motherhood and happiness. but they were still the same people who'd fallen in love over harvest dinners and long conversations, who'd chosen each other despite the odds. "I love you," Nathaniel said, turning to face him. "Just as much now as the day we married. More, maybe." "Definitely more," Preston agreed, pulling her close. "Because now I know exactly who you are. I know how you sing to the children when you think no one's listening. I know how you look first thing in the morning and last thing at night. I know your strength and your kindness and your courage. And I love all of it." He kissed her there in the snowy street, and Nathaniel felt the same flutter in her heart she'd felt 8 years ago when he'd first kissed her in front of the parlor fire. Some things never changed. They returned to the ranch the next day to find their children well and the house still standing, despite James's attempt to climb the bookshelf and Catherine's experiment with finger painting using gravy. Nathaniel laughed and Preston shook his head, but they both knew this was exactly the life they wanted. The years continued to roll by, marked by harvests and winters, by children growing and the ranch prospering. Thomas grew tall and serious, already showing signs of inheriting his father's love of the land. Maggie was bright and curious, always asking questions and demanding to know how things worked. James was all energy and mischief, and Catherine was the baby, sweet and affectionate. When Thomas turned 10 in 1893, Preston began teaching him the ranch work in earnest, taking him out to ride the fence lines and check the cattle. Nathaniel watched them ride out together one summer morning, her tall husband and her growing son, and felt a bittersweet pang. Time was moving so quickly. The babies she'd held were becoming children. The children were becoming people with their own thoughts and dreams. "They grow up fast, don't they?" Nathaniel turned to find Sarah standing beside her. The two women had become close friends over the years, and Sarah's own 3 children played regularly with the Yates children. "Too fast," Nathaniel agreed. "It seems like just yesterday I was arriving here, scared and alone. Now look at all this." She gestured to the yard where Maggie was helping tend the garden, where James and Catherine were playing with a wooden horse Preston had carved. The ranch building stood solid and well-maintained. Cattle dotted the hillsides, and the fields were green with growing crops. "You and Preston built something good here," Sarah said. "Not just a ranch, but a real home, a family." "We did," Nathaniel said softly. "Together." That fall, Columbus got its first real school, and Nathaniel was asked to be one of the teachers. She hesitated, unsure about leaving the ranch every day, but Preston encouraged her. "You've always wanted to teach," he said. "The children are old enough now and we can manage. Sarah's right here and I can adjust my work schedule. You should do this." So Nathaniel became a teacher, traveling into Columbus 3 days a week to work with the town's growing number of children. She loved it, loved sharing her knowledge and watching young minds develop. She taught reading and writing, arithmetic and history, and found it as fulfilling as she'd always imagined. Her own children attended the school too when they were old enough, though Thomas soon grew impatient with classroom learning, preferring the practical education of ranch work. Maggie, however, thrived in the academic environment, reading everything she could get her hands on and pestering Nathaniel with questions about geography and science. "She's like you," Preston observed one evening. They were in bed, reading by lamplight while the house slept around them. "Smart and curious and never satisfied with simple answers." "Is that a compliment?" "Absolutely. I love your mind, Nathaniel, always have. It's one of the things that made me fall for you, the way you think about things." They were both in their 40s now, no longer young but far from old, comfortable in their bodies and their life together. They'd weathered hard winters and dry summers, sick children and market fluctuations, all the challenges that came with ranching and raising a family. And through it all, their love had remained steady, a foundation everything else was built on. In 1895, when Thomas was 12 and talking seriously about his future on the ranch, Preston sat him down for a talk about inheritance and responsibility. Nathaniel listened from the kitchen, proud of both her son's maturity and her husband's wisdom in preparing him. "This land will be yours someday," Preston told Thomas. "Yours and your sisters and brothers. But land is more than just ownership. It's stewardship. It's taking care of something so you can pass it on better than you found it. That's what I've tried to do, and that's what I hope you'll do too." "I will, Pa," Thomas said seriously. "I promise." Later, when the children were in bed, Preston came to find Nathaniel in the parlor where she was mending. He sat beside her, taking her hand. "I was thinking about the future today," he said, "about what happens to this place after we're gone, and it made me realize how much we've built together. Not just the ranch, but our family, our legacy. Everything good in my life comes from that day you walked into my yard." "Everything good in mine, too," Nathaniel said, setting aside her mending. "I was so lost then, Preston. I thought my life was over, that I'd never have a home or a family again. And then I found you." "We found each other," he corrected gently. "I was just as lost, I just didn't know it. I thought having the ranch was enough, that work and land were all a man needed. But you showed me different. You showed me what it meant to have a real home, a real partner. Someone to share everything with." He pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, soap and leather and sun-warmed skin. After nearly 14 years of marriage, he was as much a part of her as her own heartbeat. "I love you," she whispered. "For taking a chance on a dusty woman with a carpet bag and no prospects." "Best decision I ever made," Preston said, kissing the top of her head. "Hiring you to cook for the harvest. By winter I was planning our wedding, and I've never regretted a single moment since." They sat together in the quiet house, comfortable in their silence, listening to the wind outside and the ticking of the clock Preston had bought for their 5th anniversary. This was happiness, Nathaniel thought. Not grand gestures or dramatic moments, but this quiet contentment, this sense of being exactly where you belonged with exactly the right person. The years continued their steady march. The children grew, the ranch prospered, and Preston and Nathaniel grew older together, their hair graying, their faces lining, but their love deepening with every passing season. Thomas did indeed take over more of the ranch work, becoming his father's right hand and eventually his partner. Maggie went away to school in the East, came home with a teaching certificate, and took over Nathaniel's position when she retired from the Columbus school. James proved to have a head for business and began managing the financial side of the ranch, while Catherine, the youngest, surprised everyone by developing a talent for horse breeding. In 1905, when they'd been married 23 years and the new century was still fresh, Preston and Nathaniel became grandparents for the first time. Thomas married a neighboring rancher's daughter, and their first child, a boy they named Preston Thomas, arrived in April. Holding her grandson for the first time, Nathaniel was overwhelmed with emotion. This tiny baby was the continuation of everything she and Preston had built, proof that their love would extend into generations they'd never see. "Look what we started," Preston said softly, standing beside her and looking down at his grandson. "That day you walked onto my property, dusty and determined. All of this came from that moment. All of this came from you being kind enough to offer me work," Nathaniel corrected. "From you seeing me as more than just a desperate woman needing a job." "I saw you," Preston said simply. "Really saw you from the very first, and I knew my life would never be the same." More grandchildren followed as their children married and started families of their own. The ranch house that Preston had built additions onto over the years was often full of visiting family, multiple generations gathering for Sunday dinners and holidays. Nathaniel, now in her 50s but still strong and capable, presided over these gatherings with joy, cooking the kinds of meals she'd first made for Preston's harvest hands all those years ago. On their 30th anniversary in January of 1912, their children threw them a party at the ranch, inviting neighbors from all over the territory, now the state of Montana. The house was packed with people, some Nathaniel had known for decades, others newer arrivals to the growing community. As the evening wound down and the guests began to depart, Preston took Nathaniel's hand and led her out onto the porch despite the cold. The sky was clear and full of stars, the same stars that had shone on their wedding day 30 years before. 30 years, Preston said, his arm around her waist. Seems impossible and yet completely right at the same time. I know what you mean. Sometimes it feels like we've always been together. Other times I remember that girl I was, stepping off that stagecoach in Columbus, and it seems like a different lifetime. You're still her, Preston said. Still brave and determined. Still the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. Nathaniel laughed. I'm 53 years old, Preston. I'm gray and wrinkled and nowhere near beautiful. You are to me. You always will be. He turned her to face him, his weathered hands cupping her face. You're the love of my life, Nathaniel Yates, the best thing that ever happened to me. And I'd do it all again in a heartbeat, hire you to cook, fall in love with you, plan our wedding before winter was even fully here. I'd do it all again too, Nathaniel said, tears pricking her eyes. Every moment, every challenge, every joy, I'd choose you every time. They kissed there on the porch, two people who'd weathered 3 decades together and would weather however many more they were granted. When they finally went inside, the house was quiet except for the ticking clock and the gentle snoring of one of the grandchildren asleep on the sofa. Preston banked the fire while Nathaniel checked that all the children and grandchildren staying over were settled for the night. Then they climbed the stairs to their bedroom, the same room where their children had been born, where they'd comforted each other through sorrows and celebrated joys, where they'd built the intimate foundation of their marriage. As they lay in bed together, Preston's arms around her and her head on his chest, listening to his steady heartbeat, Nathaniel thought about the journey that had brought them here. About a frightened young woman on a stagecoach, about a lonely rancher who'd offered her work, about a broken leg that had brought them together in new ways, about a winter wedding and a harvest baby and all the years of love and labor that had built this life. What are you thinking about? Preston asked sleepily. Everything, nothing, us. She lifted her head to look at him. I was just thinking how grateful I am for all of it, for you. I'm the grateful one, Preston said, pulling her close again. You gave me everything, Nathaniel. A home, a family, a purpose beyond just working the land. You gave me love. We gave each other everything, Nathaniel said softly. That's what marriage is, isn't it? Two people building something together that neither could have built alone. Yes, Preston agreed, and we built something good. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, their breathing synchronizing the way it had for 30 years. Outside, the Montana night was cold and clear, the stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns. Inside, the ranch house held the warmth of a life well lived, of love freely given and received, of a family that would continue long after they were gone. The years that followed were gentler than those that had come before. Preston began to let Thomas take over more of the heavy ranch work, though he still rode the property daily, checking fences and cattle with an eye trained by decades of experience. Nathaniel retired from teaching entirely, content to spend her time with grandchildren, tending her garden and maintaining the household. They had health scares as they aged, as all people do. Preston's old leg injury troubled him in cold weather, and Nathaniel developed arthritis in her hands that made sewing difficult. But they faced these challenges together, the way they'd faced everything, with courage and humor and unwavering support for each other. In the summer of 1921, when they were both in their early 60s, they took a trip together, just the two of them, traveling by train to California to finally visit the aunt Nathaniel had never reached all those decades ago. The aunt was ancient now, nearly 90, but she welcomed Nathaniel warmly and listened with delight to the story of how a stagecoach robbery had derailed her niece's journey but led her to love. "It all worked out exactly as it should have," the old woman said, patting Nathaniel's hand. "You were meant to stay in Montana. You were meant to find your cowboy and build that life. I'm glad you did." "So am I," Nathaniel said, looking at Preston. "So am I." They returned to Montana in late August in time to help with that year's harvest. It had become tradition for the whole family to gather for harvest time, children and grandchildren pitching in with the work. Everyone sitting down together for the big meals. Nathaniel still insisted on cooking, despite offers of help. On an evening in late September, with the harvest mostly complete and the family gathered around the big dining table, Thomas stood up to make an announcement. "Sarah's expecting again," he said, his hand on his wife's shoulder. "We're going to have another baby in the spring." The table erupted in congratulations and joy. This would be Thomas and Sarah's 5th child, the 12th grandchild for Preston and Nathaniel. As Nathaniel looked around the table at all the faces, the children and grandchildren, the family they'd created, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. After dinner, Preston found her in the kitchen, putting away the last of the dishes. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how it all started," Nathaniel said. 40 years ago this month, I walked onto this property with nothing but a carpetbag and desperation. You offered me work cooking for the harvest. By winter we were married. And now look at all this." 40 years, Preston marveled. "Seems impossible." "Seems perfect," Nathaniel corrected. She turned in his arms to face him. Every bit of it. The hard parts and the easy parts, the joys and the sorrows. All of it was perfect because we did it together. "I hired you to cook for the harvest," Preston said, echoing her thoughts. "By winter I was planning our wedding. Best decision I ever made, offering you that job." "Best decision I ever made was accepting," Nathaniel said, "and accepting your proposal, and choosing to build this life with you." They stood together in the kitchen that had been the heart of their home for 40 years, holding each other the way they had countless times before. Around them, the house was full of family, full of love, full of the legacy they'd built together. The ranch land stretched out under the Montana sky, worked by their children and soon to be worked by their grandchildren. Everything they'd hoped for, everything they'd dreamed of during those first tentative conversations while Preston's leg healed, had come true and more. "I love you," Preston whispered, "just as much as the day I married you, more." "I love you too," Nathaniel said, "always have, always will." And there in the kitchen where she'd cooked her first meal for him 40 years before, where they'd fallen in love over quiet conversations and shared dreams, they kissed. The same love that had brought them together during harvest season all those years ago was still there, still strong, still the foundation of everything good in their lives. The party continued around them, grandchildren running through the rooms, their own children talking and laughing, the sound of family filling every corner of the house. And at the center of it all were Preston and Nathaniel, the cowboy rancher and the woman he'd hired to cook, who'd found in each other everything they'd ever needed and built a life that would echo through generations. As autumn deepened into winter that year, they spent their evenings by the fire, Preston carving toys for the new grandchild expected in spring, Nathaniel knitting tiny garments. They talked about the past and the future, about the children and grandchildren, about the ranch and its prospects. And every night, they climbed the stairs to their bedroom together, grateful for another day, another season, another year of the life they'd built. On their 40th anniversary in January of 1922, they renewed their vows in the same parlor where they'd first married, surrounded by their children and grandchildren. The preacher who'd married them was long dead, but a younger minister from Columbus spoke movingly about lasting love and commitment, about the example Preston and Nathaniel had set for their family and community. When it came time for them to speak, Preston took Nathaniel's hands in his blue eyes still as bright as they'd been when he was a young man. 40 years ago, I hired you to cook for the harvest, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. By winter, I was planning our wedding, unable to wait even a few months to make you my wife. It was rash and fast, but it was the most right thing I've ever done. You've given me everything, Nathaniel. A home, a family, a life worth living. I love you more today than I did 40 years ago, and I'll love you more tomorrow than I do today. That's my promise to you, for however many years we have left. Nathaniel's eyes were wet with tears, but she was smiling. You saved me, Preston. I didn't know it then, but I was drowning in grief and loneliness, and you threw me a lifeline when you offered me that job. You gave me purpose and hope, and then you gave me love. Everything good in my life comes from you, from us, from what we built together. I love you with everything I am, and I always will. They kissed while their family applauded, and then the celebration began. There was food and music, stories and laughter. Thomas told the story of his parents' meeting, embellished over the years into family legend. Maggie played the piano while everyone sang. The grandchildren performed a play they'd written about their grandparents' courtship. As the sun set over the Montana prairie, painting the snow-covered land in shades of pink and gold, Preston and Nathaniel stood together at the window, watching the last light fade. This is what happiness looks like, Nathaniel said softly. This moment, this life, this love. I wouldn't change a single thing. Neither would I, Preston agreed. Not one single thing. They lived many more years together, seeing more grandchildren born, watching their family grow and prosper. They celebrated their 50th anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. Through it all, their love remained constant, a steady flame that warmed everyone around them. When Preston passed away in his sleep in the winter of 1931, 2 months shy of his 77th birthday, Nathaniel felt as though part of her soul had been torn away. They'd had 50 years together, 50 years of love and partnership, and it still wasn't enough. She wanted more time, more mornings waking in his arms, more evenings sitting together watching the sun set over their land. But she also knew how blessed she'd been. How many people got 50 years with their soulmate? How many people built a love that lasted through decades and challenges and all the ordinary wear of daily life? She'd had something precious, something rare, and she was grateful for every moment of it. She lived 4 more years, spending her time with family, telling stories about Preston to grandchildren and great-grandchildren who hung on her every word. She never stopped missing him, but she carried him with her always, in the ranch they'd built together, in the children they'd raised, in the love that had shaped her entire adult life. On a spring morning in 1935, Nathaniel passed away peacefully in her sleep, in the bedroom she'd shared with Preston for over 50 years. She was 76 years old, surrounded by family, and her last words were about the day she'd walked onto the ranch property, dusty and desperate, and found the love of her life. They buried her beside Preston in the family cemetery on a hill overlooking the ranch. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered to say goodbye, to celebrate a life well lived and a love that had created all of them. Thomas, now 62 and running the ranch with his own sons, spoke at the graveside. "My mother used to tell us that she came to this ranch to cook for a harvest season and ended up staying a lifetime. She said my father hired her in September, and by January they were married. It seemed fast to outsiders," she said, "but when you know, you know." And they knew. They knew from the very beginning that they were meant to be together, and they built a life on that certainty. Everything we have, everything we are, comes from the love they shared. And that love doesn't end here. It continues in all of us, in our children and their children. It continues in this land they worked together, in this ranch they built together. Their love is immortal because we carry it forward. As the family left the cemetery and returned to the ranch house for the gathering that followed, the Montana wind blew gently across the prairie, stirring the grass and carrying with it the whisper of old stories. Stories of a woman who'd been thrown from a stagecoach and walked until she found hope. Of a rancher who'd offered her work and found love. Of a harvest courtship and a winter wedding. Of 50 years of partnership and devotion. Of a love story that had started fast and lasted forever, creating ripples that would echo through generations not yet born. The ranch still stood, worked now by the fourth generation of the family Preston and Nathaniel had created. The house had been expanded and modernized, but the bones of it were the same. The kitchen where Nathaniel had cooked her first meal still the heart of the home. The land still rolled away to the horizon. Cattle still grazed the hills, and every harvest season the family still gathered to bring in the crops together, honoring the tradition that had started it all. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the work was done, and the family sat together on the porch watching the sun set, someone would tell the story again. The story of how it all began, of a woman who came to cook for the harvest and a man who couldn't wait until spring to make her his bride. Of a love that started in September and was sealed by January but lasted 50 years and beyond. It was a good story, a true story, a love story for the ages. And in the telling and retelling, Preston and Nathaniel lived on, their love immortal, their legacy secure, their happily ever after complete.